get behind the pulpit. You will present the research done by IHS Markit, which is a wonderful consulting firm. You accepted to replace Denis Chemoul. He was not able to be here today. He had to stay in Paris. So you accepted to present this wonderful piece of research, and you will tell us also about the deadlines. How long will we have to face that semiconductor crisis? And you will tell us a little bit about the perspective for the coming months and years. Thank you very much, Fanny. Yes, hi, hello, everyone. I'm very happy to be able to share my presentation with you today. First of all, I'd like to thank all the stakeholders who contributed to the organization of this field meeting. I'm very glad that I'm able today to share our vision of the market with you. As we have seen in the introduction, the automotive industry is going through very deep, it's an actual revolution, it's really changing. There's a reason why I feel this year is called the Green Future of Automotive. And I think it was very important to start this day before we have an in-depth look at hydrogen, at batteries, at the evolution of and the necessary transition from the perspective of the industry itself. I thought it was important to have a look at what's happening within the industry and to understand why we are where we are, to have a look at the state of play, what we need for the present decade, and how this revolution that we will go through in the next 10 years is going to become concrete, is going to what it's going to mean for OEMs and for the market. So I do not have a remote control. I do now. Thank you very much. So for today, I'd like to cover the history, and I'd like to tell you a little bit about the regulations, because we know that regulations have a huge influence on the market evolution, and we know that this is probably the strongest impact with regards to the evolutions that we expect for the next 10 years. So how is this going to look like in terms of the mix of technology, the technological mix? We've been talking about electric vehicles quite a lot, but throughout the next 10 years, we are going to have cohabitation with different types of hybrid, electric. We'll have the emergence of hydrogen, as we have mentioned it before, especially in the introduction. And I'd also like to share with you a vision of the OEMs. Like, how do we perceive OEMs in terms of their product planning? What impact will that have over the next 10 years? And how are they going to address this challenge that they are faced with for the next decade and for even what's coming next? So, and finally, I'd like to give you a bit of an overview of the opportunities and of the challenges that this transition is going to create, especially with regards to the impact on production stakeholders. So powertrain production stakeholders, whether we talk about suppliers or even OEM factories that used to produce engines. So I'll give you an overview regarding batteries as well, even though that will be covered very largely later down the line during more detailed sessions. And then finally, I will get back to that crisis of semiconductors, which has had a huge impact on the industry, as Fanny just mentioned. And it is true that IHS Markit has produced quite a lot of reports regarding vehicle production. This is really our DNA, it's our specialty. And I'm sure that you have seen the latest numbers, the latest figures in the press. So I will cover that a little bit and tell you about our vision for the next years. Regarding regulation, what you need to understand is that the regulation is already separated in two groups. First of all, we have everything relating to pollutants, so happening at regional level and having an impact on any and all vehicles. So any segment A vehicle, anybody with a premium SUV needs to limit their pollutant emissions. So it used to be Euro 4, 5, and 6. They lasted a specific number of times, but after Dieselgate, after the introduction of real driving emission tests, we went through several stages that happened quite quickly, and that made it necessary for OEMs to have a powertrain policy that was a bit maybe more complex, I'd say, in that we had to face the introduction of WLTP. We had to create powertrains that were were compliant with Euro 60 temp in full, and we've had to really renew the different components. The next big step will, of course, be Euro 7, and we'll get back to that in a minute. Right now, the timing is, and even the contents of Euro 7 is not entirely known. It's TBD for the moment, but it's a new stage that will be a threat for conventional powertrains because it will reduce the pollutant threshold even more, lower it even more. And then we have everything relating to CO2. And as you well know, this is covered by the CAFE norms that apply to all vehicles sold within the fleet. So 2020, 2021 will be a turning point. 2020 was the year during which we introduced the CAFE rule with a 95 grams of CO2 on average per fleet. So we know that it's a bit more complicated than that. Every manufacturer has a specific target that is indexed to their sales. But what I really want to insist on today is really basically what's next. What are the next stages? 2025 and 2030 had been identified as the next big deadlines in terms of reductions of CO2 emissions. 2018, we adopted, after a proposal of the European Parliament, a first target with norms that wanted a reduction by 15% for 2025 and minus 37.5 for 2030. This was the standard at industry level. This was the standard proposal at industry level, but it had become clear since the end of 2019, and the communication from the European Commission was very clear on with the Green Deal, which is a much broader initiative, which is not just about the automotive market. The idea of the Green Deal is to really reduce the greenhouse gas emissions in order to become carbon neutral. And 2030 has been identified as a major step in the fight against CO2 emissions. So it was very clear from then on that there would be a new package, a new regulation package that would be announced. And of course, even though the content was to be multi-sector, it was clear to us that automotive industry would be impacted. So I think it was clear also for the whole industry that new CO2 standards would be enforced. And the question was mostly what level will we talk about in terms of figures and numbers. So as you've seen, I'm sure, on July 14th, we've had the announcement of the Fit for 55 package, so new regulations that were announced by the European Commission. And we had a bit of uncertainty regarding 2030, regarding the level that was going to be demanded for the fleets of the different manufacturers. The proposal, which is not fully adopted, but the new proposal goes for a minus 55 target versus 2021, which constitutes an increase, a quite severe increase of the reduction target. So we used to be minus 37.5, is now minus 55 that we are aiming for. And in parallel to that, for the first time, this roadmap, this reduction target for our CO2 emission also integrates the next decade, so post 2030. And the main new aspect is that 2035 date, 2035, where we'd like to have a minus 100% in terms of the fleet performance. So minus 100%, in a way, doesn't really leave room for anything but powertrains that are zero emission, of course. So that means electric vehicle, that means hydrogen, and it means also maybe some niche technologies such as alternative fuels, etc. So, of course, there will be a huge acceleration effect because it means we will ban thermal engines and even electrified thermal engines. So this is really something that will have a huge impact on the industry and on OEM strategies, since, of course, all of this is integrated in a more long-term vision by 2050 rather, and Europe again wants to be carbon neutral in order to achieve their goals of the COP21 and the Paris Agreement. let's say a vehicle remains on the road for about 15 years. If by 2050 all of our mobility needs to be carbon neutral, it means it's not just about the vehicles that we sell, it's about all the vehicles in the fleet. So we'll work on retro planning by 2035, and I find that this approach is relatively consistent. But we did have countries that unilaterally had become leader. Norway wants to be neutral by 2025. I'm thinking about the UK or the Netherlands as well. And this is integrated in a dynamic aiming at reducing emissions long term in order to achieve our carbon neutral objectives. It's always hard. It's always complicated to know exactly what the magnitude will look like in terms of new standards. So I thought it was interesting to have a bit of a representation in terms of effective grams. So what is going to change if we increase the goal and move from minus 37 to minus 50%? So on the graph you can see on the screen, the blue line represents the former regulatory context. So with an increase, so by 95 grams for 2020, minus 15% 2025, and minus 37.5 in 2030. What you can see here is that when you represent graphically, when you have a graph showing the CO2 performance based on our former provisions for the end of 2020, so upstream from those, from whatever we saw in the past 6 months, what you need to realize is that even if we stick to the minus 37.5%, based on our prediction, basically we are above by 12 grams per kilometer compared to what was requested for the 37.5% reduction. So even if we had stuck to the old protocol, we were already above our aim. So now we have an even stricter target. So this is minus 50, not even minus 55, and it adds about 15 grams more. So we need to reduce the emissions by 15 grams more. So that has completely changed the way that we saw the future. It has changed the way we understand the market compared to what was expected from a regulatory perspective. So for manufacturers, the only choice is to accelerate and to invest massively on new platforms and new products. So this is really what has motivated all of the manufacturer announcement that you've seen over the past 9 months since the beginning of the year. And I'm sure you followed, same as I have. All of the manufacturers, all of the automotive manufacturers have communicated on a target for electric vehicles by 2030 in Europe and in the world, with a certain number of brands that claim that they want to be fully electric starting on a certain date. So it's really about massively accelerating the process, which we had never seen since then.
This is entirely motivated by the new regulatory context that was expected by manufacturers, and they have anticipated these new standards rather than waiting to assert their leadership in terms of electric vehicles and position themselves in this race to electrification. So if we look at the mix itself, if we compare our former forecasts, we can see without going into the details of the figures, we were around 40% of EVs in 2030, at the time at minus 37.5. Our latest sales by Powertrain, which takes into account this minus 55%, we have a significant increase compared with our old scenarios, and we reach nearly 60% of EVs in 2030, which is a very high level, but this is the level we've perceived as being necessary for the fleet of the various manufacturers are in line with regulations. That's in terms of sales, but it translates also in the production mix, because somehow, even if Europe produces a lot of vehicles which are not necessarily dedicated to be sold in under the KEFI regulation, the European manufacturers must provide the right level of electrified vehicles to reach the right levels. In our latest forecast in terms of European production, in including also Russia and Eastern Europe. We have here, as you can see, the figures I have aggregated also other vehicles, but we still have 50% of conventional vehicles, which we produce for the local Russian or exports in East Africa. And finally, hybrid vehicles, where the mild hybrid has been hit by this strategy, because we have reoriented some platform product investment towards EVs rather than multi-energy vehicles. So a mix which has evolved significantly over the last 9 months, and then again, because the ecosystem itself has evolved significantly. We could wonder about the share of hydrogen, and that would be dealt with during these 2 days. The hydrogen ecosystem, what are our forecasts for the rolling out of this technology? As you can see here, it is rather reduced. Why? And I think we'll come back to the details of this in the next sessions, but the share of hydrogen is very promising to decarbonate our mobility. However, today, the whole of our regulations are established in what we call in tank to wheel. We don't take into account the upstream one. The vehicles with a battery is very adapted to the current regulation. And in addition, the issue of decarbonating fully the whole cycle requires to have hydrogen that is decarbonated. And this is what we were talking about just before. And to do that, this is an effort that is not only in the hands of the automotive industry. We're talking about the blue or green hydrogen at a low cost, which requires to have an electric mix by country that is green. So this is the case in France, but it's far from being the case in other countries. So according to me, there's still many challenges that got to be addressed for this technology to become profitable and meaningful at European level. However, there will be, let's call them pilot programs and development in this decade, probably, and which is not included in the graphs I've just shown you, in medium and heavy commercial vehicles like trucks and buses, where it is meaningful. A bus in a city center that wants to reduce its carbon footprint and has a fleet of buses that goes from A to A, even if we have no infrastructure, hydrogen could be a solution. So here we are really, hydrogen will be a technology that will have its role to play in the European mix. However, for the 2030 period for light vehicles, we don't think that beyond some pilot programs on commercial vehicles, it will represent a visible part of the mix. About 2035, the situation could be completely different, especially if this reduction is adopted by the member states. So to come back to the mix, is that we've seen an acceleration that is significant for 26, 27. And what you should understand is that somehow we have a conjunction of factors that go towards electrification. As I mentioned it, we have this wall of CO2 in 2030 with this reduction of minus 55% expected for all. But at the same time, we will have, as I said in my instruction, the implementation of Euro 7. So this has motivated a lot of manufacturers to reorient their strategy in favor of programs and platforms that are electric only and not multi-energy, since to meet the Euro 7 standards, you need to have more equipment, the post-treatment of emissions, which is very costly. In a B segment, having a Euro 7 content and electrified is going to represent an enormous overcost. And if you want to have a scaling up on electric vehicles, plays in favor of dedicated programs, and this is what has motivated the reorientation of major programs on this segment. But what we've seen, it's not visible on all segments, but for the lower end vehicles, we have the effect of the price parity, where the curves are crossing between liquid vehicles and thermal engines, has been brought forward compared to before due to the impact of this Euro 7 standard and the new CO2 standards. I wanted to talk about some OEM strategies without going into the details because I think I might go over time given the session we have today, but I'll be very happy to answer your question outside this session. As far as Stellantis is concerned, it's a very good example. STLS Small, which is the replacement of the CMP platform, will be electric only, where before we had a multi-energy platform. So when we replace a 2.8, these are electric only vehicles. So when we see the volume of Stellantis in Europe, this has an impact on our European mix, and our understanding is that it's going to be a direct consequence of this conjunction of factors of Euro 7 and CO2. So an example is Stellantis with a mix of electrification that is rather significant, as we can see on the right. So the scheme on these OEMs, you have the production by model typology, so between the dedicated vehicles only sold in electric version, the vehicles that are multi-energy that you can buy in hybrid or electric, and IC hybrid without options in powertrain. Then you have the production by platform group, so the mix by platform. We know that on the top OEMs in France, in Europe, we have large volume ones, like CMP replaced by STLS Small, replacing MP2, etc. And the mix by powertrain, where it's not about platform, but type of powertrain installed, regardless of the platform. So at Stellantis, as we can see very quickly, we had dispersion of the conventional powertrain and the mix of mild and electric vehicles. For Volkswagen, we know the ambition of Volkswagen to become somehow aspirational in terms of electric vehicles and have a leading position. So very high volumes of electric vehicles, all in BEV only, so very little mobility, and then electric only vehicles, and a new platform called SSP, which will replace MEB and PPE. Concerning Alliance Renault, Nissan, Mitsubishi Alliance, it is interesting to know that we consider CF B2B multi-platform because it's a carryover that is rather significant with 50% parts in common. This is why we consider it as multi-energy, even though the model based on this CMFB would be dedicated. This is the Renault 4 and Renault 5. Concerning the mix by powertrain, it's interesting to note that somehow we have a rather rich family because we have mild and PHEV, the e-power, and of course, an acceleration that is quite significant on EVs. Concerning Daimler, concerning the renewal platforms, we had the EMEA is going to replace so GLA, GLB, and so on. It's interesting to know that the EVA2 platform, which is used for the model presented in Munich, will be very quickly replaced by a new family called MB.EA. And Mercedes has also announced its desire to have a dedicated platform for commercial vehicle, also for AMG vehicles. In terms of mix, a lot of electric vehicles, of course, and Daimler has announced its desire to be ready to be BEV only. It's not something that we reflect here, but it will have in its range vehicles the possibility to speed up on EVs. And finally, BMW, we see a new platform called N-Car, which is the new E-Class, which is BEV and PHEV, which is rather unique. It's not BEV only, but there will be the PHEV as well in dedicated models. So a rather unique strategy from BMW that we allow it to address high margin markets, which are not ready for BEV only by 2025, 2030. Ford has reduced volumes due to this fact of reorienting commercial vehicles to abandon private vehicles. BEV only by 2030, this is why it justifies the increase in EVs. And in terms of platform, the access to the MEB from Volkswagen, as we can see in green in platforms, and therefore involves a drastic change in volumes. So that was for the manufacturer's part, and now I would like to address the challenge and opportunities we can see associated to all this. Of course, we'll be talking in the sessions to come to how to reach a transition that is fair and leaves nobody on the side of the road. And I think that the production of powertrain is a significant aspect to keep in mind. Historically, we've been producing over 21 million engines, a majority for local consumption, very little exports, only 15%. And we can see that according to our forecast, by 2030, we're going to half this production to go under the 10 million euros by 2030. So Europe will not become the European base for motors for other regions. So what does this mean? A significant change in the ecosystem of production of powertrains to adapt to this ramp up of production of electric motors and this loss of capacity of thermal engines. As we can see that for batteries is going to require a lot of scaling up in terms of capacity in Europe. All the manufacturers' plan we've seen since the beginning of the year were supported by the creation of gigafactories. We've been following the development of ACC, and Yann Vincent will talk about it tomorrow. But Renault and Vision have also announced two gigafactories, Volkswagen also. So a very and the announcement of productions of cells. To give you an idea, within 1 year, we have doubled our forecast in terms of capacity of cells, 700 gigawatt hour. That we can see in the blue bars. So if you compare it with the demand coming from EVs, we have a strong scaling of production of cells in Europe, which will be in 2025, we'll be ready to meet the changes of the subsidiary. But then the challenge remains in 2030, because electrification would be speeding up and will require incredible production capacities. And finally, a topic I think that is close to the heart of many of you, the crisis of semiconductors. You've probably have read articles over the last few days about the degradation of the AHS market concerning volumes of production. These are our latest figures. So the latest trend, 2021, we have degraded our forecast of production for the second half, and we forecast now a reforecast, identical to 2020. So we have a trend at 0% compared with 2023, which was a health crisis year with a lot of factories stopped for a long time. And therefore, this semiconductors crisis, which at the beginning of the year was somehow pulled by issues of supply and external events, such as the storms in Texas and fire in a factory, today, due to health measures in Malaysia, which are continued, we have a durable effect of this crisis. We no longer forecast a recovery in 2022. If we take 2019, 2020 was a drop of 23% compared with 2019. 2021 will be flat. In 2022, we have a scenario at 12%. So we'll have to wait 2023 to have a rebounds effect, for which, if this scenario is confirmed, we have objectives that are relatively favorable for 23, 24, 25. Stocks have been emptied. So what we're going to sell in 2022 will be strictly what we can produce. There'll be no effect of strategic sales. So demand will be constrained. So over 23, 24, we expect an effect of increase connected to this demand which was constrained in 2022 and the recovery of the crisis of semiconductors. So something that is more or that will last longer than what we had forecasted at first due to external elements and acts of God, such as the health measures in Malaysia. So this is what I meant to present today, and I'd be delighted to answer all your questions later in the various exchanges that we'll have together. Thank you. Thank you to IG Smart, and thank you. This was really rewarding, and thank you for the latest figures you presented today at the FIL Romain Gillet. And as you suggested, since we are slightly late, you can ask your question directly during the break or at lunchtime, because Romain Gillet is going to stay with us. So no problem with that. So thank you again, Romain, for this presentation. We're going, without further ado, before we go for a break, we'll have a presentation, and we're talking about the transition, and it will be the theme of this next conference. So to introduce who is going to join us, his speaker on the Brexit was really appreciated in 2018, sorry. So we asked him to be with us, and he asked with a lot of enthusiasm. This is Thomas